Hello from MV Ranch. All right, I thought we would, you never can go forward without learning what you've done in the past. So I'm going to ask Mike a couple of questions about his job that he just retired from. Before we get started, you need to know that whenever I met Mike and he was row cropping with his dad, I'd come to Hornersville, Missouri to visit, and along the way he would play a game with me and ask me, what's that crop growing in that field? And that's how I learned the difference between a cotton plant and soybeans and watermelons and potatoes and things growing in the field. So he's taught me a lot about flatland farming just by asking me questions and explaining some things. So, and Mike has learned a little bit about cattle farming from me. So tell him a little bit about what you've learned from.
Well, I learned the difference between Angus, Brangus, Herefords, all the different kinds of cows that exist. Of course, it helped that Budge, her father-in-law, or my father-in-law, her daddy, well, we call him Budge. That's his nickname ever since he was young. But he was worked a sale barn for many years and also worked for the government himself way back in the day, and he's a pretty sharp man, so could learn a lot from him. Still could learn a lot from him if I had the time.
Okay, so let's tell everyone a little bit about the job that you just retired from.
Ooh. How
it kind of got started.
34 years.
That's a long time.
That's a long time for them to have to put up with me. But yeah, I started there and let's see, that would have been September of '87. Worked for 34 years and retired this past February of 22.
It's really a conservation effort from the government trying to keep from having another dust bowl, because so much of the topsoil has been was used in the West, and it came all the way from California all the way through.
Yeah, that's what the agency originally was developed for. It's had many names. Most people recognize it as, the older generations recognize it as ASCS, which stood for Agricultural Stabilization Conservation Service. Then we switched names in the, I think it was early 90s, to Conservation Farm Service Agency. Then we went to Farm Service Agency. Just a few years later, everybody just calling it FSA now. So, but yeah, the reason why that was program or agency it was created is because of the big dust bowl back in the early 1930s, I believe that's correct, and that's been the existence of the agency and for a while. So, what other questions you got for me?
Well, what did you have to do in the field when you first got started?
Well, first thing I had to do is I had to learn how to organize aerial slides of the county. Granted, Duncan County, the part that I lived in, which is the south end of the county, you had flatland pretty much. I didn't know that there's even any hills in Duncan County. It tells you how naive I was. I didn't realize that Crowley's Ridge crossed the county up in the north end of the county. So I had to learn how to organize all that. Because they send you these slides back before digital came into play, and that was hard to do. If I'd get lost on trying to figure out where I was at, and my boss man and he said, "Well, here's so and so's house." I thought, wow, there's no way I'll ever figure out how to do all that. Well, it comes over time. You learn.
Well, he knows.
But I did that for, I don't know, a couple of months trying to figure it out. And then we had to do compliance. Back then was a big deal. Of course, they had set aside acres. You know, you had land would lay out. Say you had a 100-acre farm, and if you had mostly a cotton base, which a lot of that was back then, mostly cotton base around here, and you would have to set aside a portion of it. And I remember at one time it was like 25% set aside. So what farmers were doing back then is they would, if they had the ability to purchase a lot of land, they would put all their set aside on one farm and then level that during the year, and then they would kind of rotate that. That was how I think most of your bigger farms have become because of that, large farms and stuff. So yeah, but that was the thing I was probably learning first, was how to organize the slides for the county so I could do compliance, because the compliance was at least 10% of the total farms, and at that time we had around 3,000 farms just for Duncan County, or right at it, I should say. Not all of them was participating farms, but I think the county right now is roughly around 27,000 or 2,700 farms. On average, probably size anywhere from 40 to 80s to 160 blocks now.
That tells you how important farming and row cropping is in this part of the country. It's a big deal. I mean, really, the row croppers in this part of the country provide quite a bit of food for not just this area, but most of the United States and even some across the world.
Yeah, well, that was just part of my job, was compliance. I mean, in the fall when the crops were harvested, we'd done a lot of grain bins, which, like I said, most of the county was cotton, so there wasn't a great lot of grain bins to climb. And that was really before rice became a big portion of the county too, because you get in the northern end of the county, there's a lot of rice up there, and especially what we call the floodway ditches, which is a historical thing that's been created. Most people don't know much about, but there's quite a bit of rice over in the bottoms nowadays. It wasn't when my dad farmed, but it is now. It's a big thing. But there was a lot of grain bins that I measured. Watermelons and cantaloupes, I had to measure a lot of land of that because it had to meet compliance standards, and most of the farmers would hire somebody to do it, and they would hire the agency to go out and measure a farm, and we had like 6 men that worked part-time in the spring that helped me with that, and I had to oversee that, which was kind of ironic in some sense, because one of the gentlemen that was working for me was my old math teacher. And that's kind of hard to do, is to check your teacher's math. It was kind of weird for me to have to tell him, he had mistakes. But, it was part of the job. And I had a principal that worked for me, and I had two or three other gentlemen that worked for me too. That, matter of fact, one of them was Mary's kinfolk. We didn't know it at the time, but that was one of Mary's kinfolk. Yeah. But the gist of my job was mostly compliance and conservation, which conservation is not quite a big thing here back in the early days, because you didn't have a lot of it. Mostly it was what we call CRP, which is Conservation Reserve Program, and that was mostly on the hill. We had highly erodible land that had a more than 2% slope was required to, that for HEL land to be eligible for CRP back in the day. But now conservation is a lot bigger than that. It has CRP, there's EQIP, and then there's what we call continuous CRP, which is more for flatland areas, for erosion areas that have like water that runs across it quite a bit for help erosion like that next to streams and creeks and rivers.
And I remember I didn't really want to know about the grain bin days, the days that he's climbing, because those grain bins are kind of high, aren't they?
Yeah, I think a little bit, like 25, 30 feet in the air. I had some pretty good stories about that. One time I was climbing a grain bin and got to the top of it, I looked inside, and of course the lid was open, which I've learned from that experience, that you don't stick your head over in there with the lid open when the producer's not around. You never know what's going to come out there. Well, there was pigeons inside, and I squealed like a little girl. Woo! They come out of there, and after that I learned my lesson. You bang on the side. One time I climbed grain in and done my measurements and looked in there and everything and closed the lid, and I got to thinking, was that right? So I thought, well, I'll double check it. So I opened the lid and looked down in there, and there was a snake staring right at me. I closed the lid down and said, well, I think my measurement's good. So I talked to the producer about it and told him. And that fall, well, it wasn't that fall, it was that spring when they were getting rid of their corn. They had corn in the grain bin. He said, you know, we looked for that, watched for a snake when we unloaded that grain bin the whole time. Every one of us was nervous. I said, well, I don't blame you. I would have been too. But the very first grain bin that I ever measured was for a gentleman, his older gentleman, and when I pulled up to do it, he had 4 grain bins he wanted me to measure. And the very first one, he said, you measure that one right there first. He said, you tell me the results, and I'll let you measure the rest if you're right. I said, wow, no pressure. Of course, he was a little bit of a grumpy feller anyway, and so I did. I measured it, and he had already pre-weighed it at the elevator and brought it back to his farm and put it in there so he knew how many pounds he had. I was within 10 pounds of what he thought was in there. Never ever give me an ounce of trouble in the office or anything after that. I guess I made a believer out of it. Just got lucky is what it was.
I have to learn to trust you.
Yeah.
Well, I remember you using your own truck.
Yeah.
And having the wheel outside of the window,
yeah,
trying to go down the fields to measure and getting stuck a couple of times.
Oh yeah, more than a couple.
Yeah,
stuck a lot of times.
Put some miles on our truck.
The very first that I'd done that over the wheel with my dad, he didn't want me to measure with it because he didn't trust it. He said, we had to do it his old way, which his old way was 100-foot tape. Him in the truck at the end of the 100 feet and me at the other end running to try to keep up with him every 100 feet and picking up flags as he would set them out as went by. And then they finally started getting to where he would trust me, that I knew what I was doing. Of course, I was measuring in chains. He was measured in feet, which a chain is 66 feet. And so, 20 chains, that's a quarter of a mile. 40 chains, that's half mile. Or excuse me, not a half mile. Half mile. 80 is a mile, stuff like that. And then you take change times change and your answer and move the decimal place up 1, it tells you acres. Well, it was simpler math to do it that way. You didn't have to take it, length times width times, or divided by 43,560, which is how many feet's in a square acre, or in an acre squared. So he would have to do it his way, and I'd already have the answer and give it to him. And we went through that for about 2 seasons. Then he finally started trusting me and let me do it myself. So that was fun.
Well, I mean, everywhere we go, whether we're in a restaurant or whatever, in shopping, we always have, if there's a farmer in the building, they're going to find Mike, and they're usually going to tell us hi and talk to him a little bit. And so, what are some of the most memorable farmers that you remember? Not by name, but mainly by story.
Well, there's one gentleman back before we had computers, but a lot of our forms we still filled out by hand in the early days. His first name was Philip, I'll give you that much. And I was writing his name out, and he told me, he said, I just have one L. I said, oh, I'm sorry. Which I had a piece of paper that showed me his name and address and everything. And so I just out of habit, because most people's 2 L's. Well, he told me, he said, I'm going to tell you like I told a young lady that works at the lawyer's office. You kept putting 2 L's in my name. at the lawyer's office, and I told her, I said, next time you do that, he said, I'm just going to reach over and kiss you. So after that, every time he walked in the door, I said, there's Philip 1L. How you doing, Philip 1L? And then there's other guys that had quite an impression on me. Some good, some not so good, but there's lots of good stories. A lot of gentlemen that's retired that are really good men.
Well, what were some of the most challenging things about the job that you had? Some of the changes that you went through?
For the most part, the people I worked with pretty much stayed. There was always be some new people would come in once in a while as part-time help and things like that. That they'd have to get used to you. You'd have to get used to them. But as far as anything just standing out and being difficult, it's just not really much difficult about. You have a good working relationship with producers and your co-workers, and that makes all the difference in the world if you got a good co-workers to work with.
Yeah, I think you had some really good ones. Y'all were more like family than anything. And through the years, you went through many computers at your desk.
Yeah, I did that. I ended up having, let's see, I think, well, I'll start from the beginning. My bosses, there was Martin, then there was Stan, then there was Aaron, then there was Brandy, then I ended with Tyler. So I went through 5 bosses in a 34-year period. And see, the first one retired, and he had, I can't remember how many years he had, something like 30. Stan, he was there for like 3 or 4 years, and until he could get to the county where he lived at, and he moved up there, and then he eventually retired, I think, up there. I know he did. And then the next one was Aaron Ivey, which was a local gentleman. He's the one who really and truly hired me. He worked for Martin when I was hired. He was there, I can't remember how many years, and he had his father-in-law retired, and he died just like within months after he retired, and that was the fear he always had. And he got to enjoy a couple of years himself, and then when he retired, he had pretty much done the same thing as his father-in-law. And then after Aaron was Brandy, which was, she was a good woman. She had differences between Aaron and her that I really liked. Everybody was on board and knew what was going on, which I loved that because she didn't depend on one person to tell everybody what was going on. I loved that about her. And then we went to the gentleman that's working, currently the boss there, Tyler. And Tyler was young. As a matter of fact, when he started, he was just turned 30. And I had 31 years in when he started. I thought, I've been working here longer than you've been alive. So, but that's different experiences. Like I said, most of my co-workers, they grew up working with me, and I grew up working with them. So.
Yeah. And his bosses were always really family friendly, because if we ever had any trouble with sickness with our kids or anything like that, and since I'm a school teacher, school teachers really don't get a whole lot of days. We really depended on Mike's job to help, especially when there was something going on at school or something like that we were at different schools.
She could, because she had more kids to deal with than I did. I only had our 2 boys.
He could get there so much faster.
Yeah.
And some of the things that they do now on the computer, they have tests that you have to take every single year to make sure that
sexual harassment. Yeah, you got I had one of my coworkers, older lady that retired several years ago when all this kind of started. You had to, take all these tests, and one of them was something about sexual harassment. She said, worried about it. I'd like to have some of it. So she was a nut. And then there's all kinds of tests. You have to do that every year. It's the same stuff every year. And then, I understand the reasoning why, but I think it's a bit monotonous sometimes. But yeah.
Well, and probably, like most people think, probably the most stressful part of the job is the paperwork. And his job is no different than anybody else's. The files and things that they have to put up with and keep up with.
Yeah.
And he remembers farm numbers and things like that, just to
phone numbers.
Make it easier for himself each year when they have to go through a sign-up program.
Yeah, just the other day, one of our farmers that works in the county, he said, I don't know this other particular farmer, and I'm retired already, and so I just out of the top of my head, I quoted him his phone number to him, and he looked at me kind of funny, but yeah, it just no certain. You call people long enough, you know their phone numbers. Just like, of course, technology nowadays, it's everybody's got them in the scroll, or just call so and so.
No more Rolodex.
Yeah, yeah, I've done many Rolodex.
Well, when you and your dad were farming close to the Reeves area, I know the farm had a name to it, Sunset or something like that.
Well, there was Sunrise. That was a location where there used to be a community called Sunrise, and then there was Reeves, and then there was Treasure Island. Everybody's got farm names for places and things. Like where we're at right now is her nephew-in-law, I guess you might say. It's the Spence place. So.
Well, one of the things I had to learn when we first got married, we lived in Hornersville, Missouri, and
where I grew up.
Yes, and I had to learn the difference between gumbo and ice cream land. Can you tell them a little bit about gumbo and ice cream?
Well, my dad's definition was different, probably in some of them's. Ice cream ground is what you call around here is high sand where you grow cotton and stuff. Of course, my dad farmed in the bottoms, which was mostly gumbo, and that's where Treasure Island is. But his definition was different because he would say, this is God's country over here in the gumbo, and the reason why he called it God's country was because if you make it, it was God's will that you made it, because it's tough farming. So.
Well, the gumbo is closer to the floodway ditches and is more likely to flood, and it takes longer to dry out because the gumbo is a little stickier and muddier.
Heavy dirt.
Not as much sand. But the ice cream land...
Yeah, it's high sand where we're currently living at right now is high sand, and Mother's Day is always known for windy times and sand's blowing always, so yeah, that's what they call ice cream ground.
Well, what do the farmers do to keep their crops safe from those sand blows?
Well, cover crop, or your winter weeds, sometimes they'll just leave it standing and no till, and then just come in and spray in after they get their crops planted, but before it comes up, spray it and kill leave it there, so that way it helps with it, keeps the sand from blowing.
Some of my favorite pictures that are going to be on this video are going to be of the pivot systems, because they have to irrigate their crops. So you're going to see one of those pivot systems in our video this time.
Yeah, pivots been made, and pivots and flood irrigation has made a world of difference in yields and in production anymore. Of course, when my dad was farming, we didn't have any irrigation. It was just Mother Nature's and God's will to make it there. And it makes a difference. But years ago, they planted a lot of wheat and rye, and some of them still do that. And they used to use vetch, which was... Yeah.
You're going to see a picture of vetch in our video this time.
It was pretty common back in the day to have vetch with rye, and they would plant that. And of course, a lot of a lot of the farmers done that on the sand, and we would go grab it up and pull it up because it was everywhere at that time because it was just grows wild after a while.
Didn't
So
they
we'd get it off the ditch banks and stuff and gather it up and we'd take it and put it in the chicken pen, and chickens absolutely love vetch.
Didn't they do like a couple of crops at a time too?
Well, that's way back in the old days before my time. Believe it or not, there's older days.
No.
Yeah. And they used to plant, when my grandpa was farming, they would plant corn and then plant beans in the middles, and then they would harvest the corn and have beans afterwards. Yeah.
I think that's pretty smart. 2 crops at one time.
He also had a team of mules that at 11:30, no matter how hard he wanted to keep working, they were heading to the barn. So they would go through the field just fine. But when they get to the end, whether it's this end or that end, and it was 11:30, they were heading to the barn to get feed.
Well, I appreciate you telling everybody about your job and your years of experience and how it's really important. Some of the things that you guys are doing and the farmers in the area, we really appreciate farmers because we know without them, we will not be eating.
Yep.
And we don't mind the tractors in the middle of the road so much around here because we know why.
Yeah.
And we don't get upset with them. We just
you got corn that feeds us, and also feeds your livestock and all your animals. You got soybeans, which does the same thing and also they make soybean oil that's used in a lot of your snack foods has soybean and also cottonseed oil in them nowadays. Most people don't even realize it.
You used to work at the cotton gin too.
I worked at the cotton gin part time in the winter months. At night, I would work a half a shift with somebody. I did that for a while. I drove truck hauling cotton bales for a while. I've run a tow motor at the gin.
That was at Hornersville, wasn't it?
Yeah. Did that. And worked at the oil mill, soybean oil mill, or cottonseed oil mill, excuse me. And I've done a little bit of everything. Worked at a hospital for 4 years. And that was even tough. I'd do that on the weekends. I'd go in I'd get off work Friday at 4:30, go home, eat a bite, sleep till about 8:30 or 9, get up, get ready, and go to the hospital and be there by 11, and work till 11 in the morning, and then go home, go to bed, sleep, get up, go back in Friday or Saturday night at 11, and work till 11 the next Sunday morning. And sometimes I'm lucky I'd go to church on time, or I'd have to go to church at 9. Excuse me. And I've done that for 4 years. That was tough.
And that was just a couple of the things that we've done to prepare to move from the flatlands to the foothills.
Yeah.
And you'll probably hear more about that. We'll go into a little more detail a little bit later on some other videos. Won't put it all in one.
Here's my story.
20-hour video. Here we go.
Yeah.
But, so right now we're just kind of preparing with the farm, trying to get ready for the foundation work to be done, and we'll be showing you guys some more of that when we're kind of excited to get that started.
I'm ready for her to retire.
Yeah, I'm ready for that too.
She's got another year, but she's going to get to do it.
185 days.
Working days.
Yes, working days.
Not counting weekends and summer. But
you know, in this position, you kind of work for the weekends most of the time. Anyway, I'm sure I'm not the only one that does that. You count from one holiday to the next. That's how you survive. So
yeah.
But I don't have any more questions unless there's anything else you want to tell them.
It's pretty much covered it all. There's a lot of good men that miss.
So I guess what we would probably both tell you is thank a farmer this week.
Yes.
Because they deserve it, and they're in the fields right now.
They're busy. Probably had to catch them on Sunday morning, maybe.
Some of them work night and day trying to get these crops in and get them going, and some of them have to redo their crops. And you know, right now the prices of diesel are so high that
$5 a gallon.
It hurts for them to be out there.
Fertilizer went from like, I don't remember exact prices here, but I know it's more than doubled from last year to this year. It's unreal. I don't know how they do it.
I admire the families that are at home waiting on the ones who are in the fields to come back, because they don't get to see their family very much during those weeks that they are planting and harvesting, and
get up and work from sun up to sundown.
It's a big sacrifice. So we appreciate you, farmers.
Yes.
Just so you know. And
I believe that Missouri has some of the most beautiful sunsets ever. Some of my favorite ones are with the pivot system in the background. Just seems so pleasant to watch it through all those wires. I've always wanted to stop at the Honeysuckle Incorporated Flower Shop in Rector, Arkansas. So for Mother's Day, Mike and I made a visit. Then we found the Buttercream Bakery in Pocahontas, Arkansas. One of the legends about how Hayti, Missouri got its name was because of the railroad tracks. Hay, tie, because those railroad tracks are made with ties. I thought that was pretty cool. I really appreciate the work that is being done on the new bridge on the floodway ditches on Highway A, which is where I drive to work most every day. The ditches and the floodways were part of the largest land projects in the world to this day, and we live just a few miles from it. It's really quite interesting when you start looking at it. 1.2 million acres of land uh, were drained from the swamp. They used to call this land Swamp East because nothing else could grow here. So all the farmland that you see and all the rich soil is because of that project. The conservation with the birds and the geese that come in and migrate, beautiful scenery with the open spaces that I get to see every day. It's just outstanding. This is evening primrose. Our fields are yellow, and that's some of the things you'll see. The vetch that grows along the sides of the road. We talked about that a little bit with cover crops. And there's actually more than one kind of vetch. This is the most common one. This is the deer vetch that actually every part of that plant is poisonous. It's really interesting to watch the transition of the fields from each season, from the winter, spring, when they're planting, which is what they're doing right now, and then all the way into harvest in the fall when everything is just as white as you can imagine. Matthew 6:25 through 34.
please hit the like button and share this video with a friend. If you want notifications when we have other videos, please click on the bell and they will be on there for you. Bye.